Right. So, so I hope you had a chance to look at the preface for Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and the first chapter. Basically, Nozick starts out by laying out what's one of his most famous assumptions, often quoted, and the central assumption of the book, which is that individuals have rights, and there are things that no one can do to violate those rights. And the sort of intuition that Nozick has here is the sort of he sort of shares the intuition that Locke has, that there are natural rights that people have. For example, the right to bodily integrity, etc., etc. The right to sustainment, something more or less like that. So he's from the outset, you can see that Nozick is someone who might not be sympathetic to utilitarianism, and we will at some point see that that's actually the case. So, and part of the reason why I'm saying this is because Nozick believes that these rights that individuals have cannot be violated in any circumstances. That's one of the side constraints, which is a subject of chapter 3, the side constraints that he imposes on moral theory and political philosophy, that no matter how much a group can benefit from violating someone's fundamental rights, they just cannot do it without being unethical. So he's going to start out from that assumption. And from that assumption, he's going to try to argue that even within those rights, it's possible to justify the existence of the state. So he's very, very sympathetic to, I guess, the sort of anarchy views that anarchist views we discussed at the beginning of this term. However, he still believes that even though most interventions are unjustified, most interventions on liberty are unjustified, it's possible just by assumptions of rationality and individuality and liberty to argue for the justification of the minimum of what he's going to call the minimal state. So yeah, so sorry. Right. So that's part of what he's going to be saying, and then his argument is going to be divided in two parts. In the first part of the book, he's going to try to argue that the minimal state is justified on these assumptions, and on the second part of the book, he's going to argue that nothing greater than the minimal state is justified, and the minimal state is just going to be a state that is going to be able to is going to have a monopoly on violence, the only legitimate monopoly on violence. So it's going to be the only actor that has that's an ethical right to exercise violence within a community. And on the other hand, it's going to be able to enforce and protect contracts. So that's basically Nozick's idea of the minimal state. And part of, I guess, what is one of the underlying assumptions that Nozick has there is that he's going to reject any sort of redistributive state. So, for example, the sort of state that Rawls likes, which is protecting the worse off, is going to be a state that Nozick rejects. And anything more substantive than that, of course, is going to be something that Nozick rejects. So any sort of, for example, of a state-run economy is going to be something Nozick rejects. And then I guess part of what's interesting about that is that he believes that this is a stable point, that you can argue from very basic assumptions about rationality, freedom, and so on to the justification of this minimal state, but that any argument that goes beyond that is not going to work, or there are going to be sound objections to that. And the sort of elements that Nozick uses to argue for these views are going to be assumptions in ethics, assumptions in political philosophy. So for example, he's going, as I mentioned, he's going to start out from something like Locke's state of nature. And I'm going to say why in a few seconds. He's also going to use some assumptions from philosophy of science, from economics and decision theory. So all of that together is some of the stuff that he uses in his book to argue for his views. And then in part 3, which we're not going to look at, he tries to argue that that's where the part of utopia comes from, because he thinks that the view that he's offering might not be a view which is very inspiring to people philosophically. So as a sort of substitute for that, he does try to argue that even within those very thin assumptions about freedom and rationality and minimal state, even with that, you can create a sort of utopian society with, you know, if there are further things obtained. But unfortunately, we're not going to be able to go into that very much. However, one thing that I find important to mention is some stuff about Nozick's methodological approach. So, for example, he mentions that he's going to be using arguments, surprising theses, unlikely counterexamples, abstract structural conditions, coming up with equivalent theories covering the same range of cases, and thought experiments. So I guess I wanted to say a little bit about each of those. So, for example, for the case of arguments, right? So arguments is a tool that we have been looking at so far in this class. And one of the important things about arguments, again, is the notion of validity. So the idea that some arguments are special in the sense that if all of the premises of those arguments are true, and the arguments have a special form, a special logical form, then those arguments are going to be logically valid. And that means that if you accept the premises, you must also accept the conclusion. And this, I mean, these sort of properties of arguments, the logical properties of arguments, are not something to be, is something which is actually quite rigorous. At the beginning of the term, I mentioned that, for example, when not only philosophers or people in the humanities use arguments, but arguments are very typical in the sciences, very typical in mathematics even. It's just that in mathematics, usually arguments are called proofs. So you start out from some assumptions about some mathematical domain, for example, the natural numbers, and then you prove some feature of or some properties for the numbers from those assumptions. And I think if we have a good example of a very rigorous approach somewhere is in mathematics. So theorems in mathematics, we know that those mathematical truths can have some sort of universal application, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not as if as if there's a different nature in the sorts of arguments that are used in philosophy and the sort of arguments that are used in mathematics. I mean, that's something that might seem like the commonsensical assumption to make about these things, but actually the structural elements that go into arguments in philosophy and in mathematics are more or less the same. What changes is the sort of objects that we are dealing with. So for example, in mathematics, we are dealing with mathematical objects such as the natural numbers, geometrical objects, topological spaces, etc., right? Hilbert spaces. And in philosophy, we are dealing with much bigger concepts and notions. But we can still use arguments as a tool. So, so that's why this is one of the important tools in the philosopher's toolkit, the idea of arguments. And then the idea of a counterexample is just, I mean, we have all seen counterexamples in real life, but obviously there are counterexamples that we can discuss at a higher level of abstraction. So a counterexample is just some sort of fact that shows that some sort of claim cannot be true. So for example, suppose that someone says all crowds are black. Then if someone comes up with a true fact that some crow is white, that suffices to show that it's false that not all, that all crowds are black. And then I guess part of the idea of unlikely counterexamples, which is interesting here, is that you can, for example, by thinking of thought experiments, which is part of the reason why thought experiments are interesting or important in philosophy, you can come up with some fancy counterexamples or some weird counterexamples. And then I guess one question someone might have is, how can a thought experiment be relevant to determining whether there are counterexamples to something? And then, and I guess part of the response to that is that usually a good thought experiment involves some conditions or some assumptions. So, for example, I'm not sure if you have ever heard about the trolley problem. Anyone here has heard about the trolley problem? Yeah, right. So, for example, in the trolley problem, we can imagine a scenario where you have a person tied down in the tracks of a train, and then another person can either save that person by pulling pushing a button, for example. But if say those 5 people say that are in the tracks of the train by pushing a button, but if they do that, then the train is going to head off in another direction where there's also another person tied down. And then obviously that's a setup for a thought experiment. It's not as if anyone is doing that. So we are imagining the situation, but the situation has been built up with assumptions that are not controversial, that we all know that it's possible to do that, etc. So it's a plausible counterexample that we could set up. And then part of the idea with those, with the trolley problem, for example, is that the question comes up there, for example, that if you were to be, for example, a utilitarian, then your theory, the utilitarian moral theory, is going to demand that if the train is headed towards the 5 people in the track, then you push the button. So you're going to end up killing someone else, the solitary person. And then part of the idea there is part of the interest there in that counterexample is that we are faced with the consequences of our moral theories in a more direct way, just by imagining these scenarios. So when we realize what it means to accept, for example, utilitarianism, that utilitarianism will be committed to telling you that you actually need to push the button in order to make and it's going to end up killing another person. So you are actually going to be killing someone and using someone, sacrificing someone just to save some other 5 people. So obviously that in itself is not going to be sufficient to defeat utilitarianism, but it sort of shows that what are the logical consequences of those intuitions. So you set up, you have a theory, you set up an imaginary scenario with that theory, and then explore the logical consequences of that scenario and find out if the consequences are too counterintuitive or too unacceptable. Then what that shows is that the assumptions that go into the scenario must be rejected. For example, the utilitarian assumption will have to be rejected. Or if you don't find them as unacceptable, then you're going to have to bite the bullet, as they say, and then defend the idea that it will be actually okay for the 1 person in the tracks to die instead of 5. So, and that's just one counterexample, right? But one idea of a counterexample in light of a thought experiment. But we have been looking at a series of thought experiments, including Rawls's original position and Hobbes's state of nature, which obviously is also a thought experiment, since we have no evidence that that's how the state of nature will look like. So that's what Nozick means. He's just making it explicit in a sense. And he's also mentioning abstract structural conditions. So what does Nozick mean by that? So I mentioned that Nozick has this discussion in chapter 3 that we're going to get to next week, which is on the issue of moral side constraints. So a moral side constraint is just a proposition, an ethical proposition that you just cannot violate because any ethical theory that violates that proposition will be morally mistaken or morally wrong. So as I mentioned here, Nozick starts out from the assumption that individuals have rights. And that means, for example, obviously that part of what that means is that there's nothing I can do to violate those rights of those individuals. That's okay. That will make it okay, even if that benefits, for example, a bunch of people. So Nozick is from the outset rejecting something like utilitarianism. And then he's going to tell us, for example, what these assumptions are, what his moral side constraints are. So, for example, what are the sorts of ethical propositions that no ethical theory should violate, that no ethical theory should be inconsistent with? And then part of what he's going to argue is that the only possible way of developing political philosophy is going to be within the boundaries of those moral side constraints. So that's the part where I guess you can bargain whether to accept something or not, but you cannot break those constraints. So, for example, I guess you could, to illustrate it a little bit further, for example, we could talk about the physical side constraints of the universe, such as the laws of nature, which is stuff that we can do anything which is consistent physically with those laws of nature, for example, right? So, for example, we know that if the theory of relativity is true, we know that no object can travel faster than the speed of light. So that's a physical side constraint, right? There's no possible physical motion for any object that can break that law of nature. If it's actually a law, of course, right? That might be revised in science. But if it's actually a law, then no object can go faster than light. And obviously, moral side constraints are not like that because they are not like laws of nature. I mean, it's physically possible to break a moral law. But what Nozick is saying is that, while it's possible to break a moral law, any theory that does so cannot be ethically acceptable and therefore politically acceptable, because one of his assumptions is going to be that political philosophy is just a branch of ethics. So we're going to discuss that in more detail next week. But yeah, those are sort of the concepts and ideas that he thinks are central to philosophical inquiry and philosophical discussion. And then there's this notion here of equivalent theories covering the same range of cases. And that's sort of a very abstract notion that people might not be too familiar with, but it comes up a lot in philosophy of science. So that we know that in the history of science and in philosophy of science, we often have theories that have more or less the same empirical predictions. So let me give you again another example. I hope it's not too abstract, but for example, if you consider Newtonian mechanics, the classical physics, classical theory of how objects move, and then the theory of relativity. Those two theories look very much the same for objects that move at speeds like ours, very far from the speed of light. So they have the same empirical consequences in that scale, for that scale, not in the larger scale, but for that scale. And then part of the interest of discussing equivalent theories is that suppose that you have two theories, T1 and T2. Suppose that you have two theories, T1 and T2, and those two theories explain the same phenomena, the same range of phenomena. So you have, for example, all of these things that you want to explain, E1, E2, E3, you want to explain those, and then you figure out that you can explain those with T1, and you can also explain those with T2. So those two are exactly as successful as the other, right? So, but imagine that those two theories have different, for example, they posit different things about reality, they have different laws, etc., etc. Then it seems that since both can make the same predictions and explain the same phenomena, then it's not possible to distinguish one from the other. So, and that shows, for example, if you were to show that there's some, for example, some philosophical. So obviously, I'm talking about empirical theories in science, right? But in order to make the contrast with philosophical theories, what's a philosophical theory meant to explain? Part of what a philosophical theory means to explain is a lot of, in this case, for example, many of our political intuitions or many of our political judgments, or for example, achieve a reflective equilibrium between our political beliefs. So if I have a theory that explains, if I have two theories in political philosophy that explain the same sort of intuitions or worries, then that might be a problem for one theory because, for example, so here's one way a philosopher might argue, right? A philosopher might say, look, all of us accept these truths. Just suppose that that's the case. All of us accept these ethical truths, just for the sake of argument, right? That we shouldn't kill, that we shouldn't steal, whatever. And then my theory explains why it's wrong to do all of those things. My theory T1. Therefore, you should accept my theory. So that's one argument that you might hear from a philosopher, right? And then the problem with the equivalent theories, or the objection with equivalent theories, will be that if you come up with a theory that can explain why, for example, killing is wrong or stealing is wrong, etc., all of the same things as the other theory could explain, but it's a different theory, then the argument that you had before, that only that theory could explain that, is undermined. So that's why it's interesting. That's why it's interesting to think about equivalent theories. So that's just on the methodology, and I think it's very interesting to for Nozick to highlight these things because it's not often explicit what are the resources that philosophers are using to make the case for their views, and he's actually just listing them and trying to explain why those are useful. And then something else that Nozick says is that it's very important that philosophers often write, and this is true still, right? I mean, Nozick wrote this book in the 70s, I think, but this is still true today, that philosophers sometimes write as if they are writing the final word or something. So they have these papers that they polish again and again systematically until it's, the argument is as tight as they can make it, and the sections are neatly delineated, and you can see sort of the flow, trying to be rigorous here, etc. And then part of what Nozick is saying is that sometimes philosophers are so eager to do that they hide stuff that's inconvenient. So for example, suppose you have some principle in your theory. So for example, think about Rawls's original position, right? So in Rawls's original position, one of the issues that comes up is that he's trying to argue that from a sort of hypothetical contract that no one actually entered into historically, we can argue that some principles are the correct principles of justice. And then obviously one problem there is, why should hypothetical contracts be relevant at all for that? And although that's something Rawls discusses, I don't, so many people still feel that his discussion of that is sort of on the surface. He doesn't really address the difficulties as well as he could. And then part of what Nozick is saying is, I mean, it's that it's perfectly fine to do philosophy with some principles or assumptions which are not quite strong or are somewhat weak or maybe are not fully justified. But if you're going to do that, then you should at least be honest and explicit about that and say, well, I have this assumption which I think is sort of intuitive, is sort of rational. I don't have a knockdown argument for that, or I don't have a closed case argument for that, but it's still something which is interesting to look at and see the consequences of that. So don't hide it under the carpet. Just make it explicit where the points of your argument are weaker, and what are the principles or issues that you think should demand further work or require further work. So the importance of intellectual honesty, is something that Nozick emphasizes. And I think it's a very important value, the value of intellectual honesty. And interestingly, it's not a value that's much discussed by philosophers, because it's obviously that's a philosophical question in itself, right? So why is intellectual honesty important? Why is it a virtue, right? I don't have an answer to that, but I mean, I guess I have some intuitions, but I don't want to, deviate too much from the subject. But it's definitely an important methodological virtue in the sciences or in philosophy to be intellectually honest. And I guess that, in a sense, I guess partly part of the justification there is that if you're aiming at truth, if you actually want to get at the truth, and not just at self-promotion or anything like that, then you have to be as honest as possible and not mislead your readers. So yeah, that more or less covers what Nozick says in the preface. So I wonder if there are any questions on that.
I have a question about the equivalent like theories.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you explained it as like the idea of like Newtonian mechanics versus like, like Einstein, like quantum mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And like they do explain the same thing. It's just the Newtonian physics is like dumbed down. Like wouldn't you would still get the same answer from Einstein's theory as Newton's theory? Like
Right.
for a certain set of like problems, but once you hit like quantum physics, you can't use Newtonian physics anymore because it just simply doesn't account for things that quantum mechanics accounts for. So they're not really equivalent theories. I mean, for like a certain set, but at what point can you say like these two theories aren't equivalent?
Right. No, I think that's an excellent question. Yeah, those two theories are definitely not equivalent, and you're completely right that both quantum mechanics, which you mentioned, and relativity, which is the example I was giving, those two theories actually account for more phenomena than Newtonian mechanics. But for example, so one thing that's interesting is there's this. So I guess I should say two things, not to get too distracted. So the first thing is that's completely right. I gave that example because getting into the sort of examples that philosophers use is sometimes a little, in these areas, philosophy of science, is usually a little bit more involved. So obviously people here could understand that, but I will have to devote like an entire class to just explain the sort of theories that look like actually equivalent theories. Some of the trivial examples that you can create, if you have taken, for example, an introduction to logic course, a very, very trivial example of trivial theories is just, for example, you can analyze a theory as a set of propositions. I mean, that sounds pretty weird, but you can analyze a theory for the set of propositions that the theory says are true, for example, right? And then there are going to be some logical properties for those propositions. But for example, that for any set of propositions, you can, for example, they are going to entail certain things. They are going to have some certain logical consequences. And one thing that you can do there is, for example, add other propositions that, for example, you can, if you have a set of sentences, for example, A, B, C, D, you can always add or G, for example, another proposition G, and that's more or less going to be equivalent to your other theory. So I mean, those are some pretty weird examples that involve logical notions. So I don't want to spend too much time on those. But for example, if you want a more concrete example about equivalent theories that use those resources, there's some work by Eleanor Knox. She's a philosopher of physics who has some papers on Newtonian gravitational theory. So Newtonian gravitational theory is just like a variant of Newtonian mechanics, where you add like extra forces and some extra parameters. And with those parameters and extra forces, you can actually have a theory which is equivalent to relativity in some, for example, in its predictions about acceleration. And again, I don't want to get that much into that, but that's a sort of theory that you can create. I mean, that's not a theory that physicists actually use to investigate any phenomena, just to be clear. But it's a theory that that she, as a philosopher of science and with a training in physics, that she has shown that can recover more or less the same predictions, and not just a subset of the predictions, right? Not just a part of the predictions, but the same predictions as these other theories. And part of what that shows is that if you add parameters, or if you put some parameters in or take some parameters out, then you can get the same explanations from theories that have different ontologies, posit different, for example, posit different ultimate elements of reality or different laws, etc. And that's, I guess, and that's the interesting thing. The interesting thing is that, and the point that I wanted to emphasize methodologically was that sometimes people argue that only their theory can explain some phenomena, right? And then if you come up with a theory that's actually equivalent to that, but has different assumptions or different posits, then the argument that they had made before, that only their theory could explain that phenomena, and therefore their theory was right, that argument is undermined. So that's the point that I was trying to illustrate. But yeah, you're right that there are definite, that needs more detail to be discussed. Any other question on the preface? Right, so let me just mention a crucial element in chapter 1, which is Nozick, as I mentioned, is going to start out, part of what he's going to do in part 1 of the book is try to argue for the minimal state. And you might wonder the following thing, right? You might wonder how is Nozick going to argue for the minimal state from his very thin assumptions, where he doesn't want to violate, for example, any sort of individual rights or any sort of property rights or any sort of so everything has to be by consent, in a sense. You just cannot argue, for example, as in the case of Rawls, you cannot just argue that for the benefit of the worse off, the state should have certain structure. Everyone is going to have to accept the structure of the state in order for there to be a state. And then part of what Nozick's methodology is going to be here is going to make use of some of the tools that we introduced last week, or we were discussing last week, which is the idea of a Pareto improvement. Part of what he's going to argue is that in a sort of reasonable scenario of a state of nature, so for example, the Lockean scenario, and I'm going to mention in a second why he chooses that. But in that sort of a scenario, if we can choose that individuals in that scenario, by their own volition, by acting rationally and giving consent, would make a Pareto improvement on their situation by having a minimal state, then that sort of shows, for example, that from that situation, a minimal state will arise just by individual choices. So that's how invisible hand explanations come into Nozick's discussion of the minimal state, because as a sort of a spoiler, what he's going to say is that in that imaginary situation, in that thought experiment, if there had been a state of nature like that, if there had been a state of nature like the Lockean state of nature with rights in this sense, then people in that state of nature, out of their own volition, without harming anyone else, will find it reasonable for their own improvement to form a minimal state, so that, and I guess part of the consequence of this is that suppose that you have a society and then you take away the state in that society and you put them in the local state of nature. If Nozick is right, and holding everything else constant, right? So we don't want to introduce elements about how nature is or how much scarcity there is. Just consider that, just leave aside those questions. But the point is that if you remove society and put individuals in a state of nature, then they are always going to get back to a minimal state by just their individual choices and following their individual, without harming anyone else, just by their own volition. As a result of individual action without any sort of guiding policy decision. That's part of what he's arguing. And obviously you might wonder about, so you remember the notion of a Pareto improvement is, a state S1 is a Pareto improvement over a state S2. If there's at least one person that prefers S1 over S2, and none who are worse off from that transition, right? So it's more or less, Nozick thinks of it more or less as similar to market economy. So for example, in an ideal market economy, I have some goods, you have some goods, and then I want what you have, you want what I have, so we trade, and then we are both better off. So that's a Pareto improvement on our situation, ideally, right? So in an ideal market economy. And then people just making those decisions are going to create an economy out of individual choices. And part of what Nozick thinks is that if we were to be put back in the state of nature, then we would also arrive at a minimal state. He gives that development in more detail in chapter 2, which I'm going to upload a lecture on, but I just wanted to clarify sort of the methodology. And then, I mean, I guess I just have to mention a couple of more things about explanations here. So, but if there's anyone who needs to leave, we're getting almost to 11:05, but I just need 5 more minutes for people who can stay. But the important point is that I wanted to emphasize is that Nozick believes that this justifies the state in the following sense. It justifies the state in the sense that it explains the state. So it explains why is it that we are going to always have a state. So if a state is inevitable in this respect, if a state is inevitable from one of our best case scenarios for the state of nature, if whenever a society is in a state of nature, like the local state of nature, they are going to form a state just by this process of Pareto improvements, then that sort of explains why the state is justified. I mean, there's an ethical dimension to that in the sense that that state arises from interactions that doesn't cause harm to anyone, theoretically speaking. So in that sense, it's morally justified, but more importantly than that, it's justified as in the sense that you see how it's not possible for a society in a state of nature to exist without eventually forming a state, right? And then Nozick, for example, and I'm going to emphasize this later on, but Nozick, for example, mentions evolution as a sort of also invisible hand explanation, where you get, for example, all of these species with their variety of properties just from random mutation plus natural selection and interaction in etc. So if you were to explain why, for example, there's so much variety of life on Earth, you don't need to appeal to any sort of designer to just explain that. You can just do that by appealing to evolutionary facts and laws. And part of what he's claiming here is that you can do the same thing for the state. If you can explain how the state arises just by looking at individuals and their individual choices and what the sort of improvements they might seek, as an inevitable consequence of that, then that explanation is going to be sort of as powerful as a sort of evolutionary explanation in that respect. And another reason why Nozick mentions that these explanations are very powerful is because they go from the non-political realm. So, for example, just individuals with making ethical decisions. So at that stage, there's no politics. Politics comes only when there's a sort of contract and political roles, etc., laws, etc. A monopoly on violence. Once you have that sort of institution, a state, then we can talk about politics. But before that, in Nozick's own assumptions, we can talk about individuals and ethics, because he already accepts ethical beliefs. And then part of his claim is that if you can explain a more complex domain, for example, the political domain, in terms of things that are non-political, just individuals, their ethical beliefs and their choices, then that's the best explanation that you can get from that domain, because it's completely general. It's parsimonious, so it assumes it doesn't assume like an autonomous political dimension. It just assumes ethics and individuals. So it's fully general and it's parsimonious in the sense of Occam's razor. And therefore, that's a more powerful type of explanation you can get. Sort of like the explanations you get in the natural sciences, for example, sometimes. So yeah, that's basically what I wanted to mention. I mean, if, as I mentioned, people can leave, but if anyone has any questions on this before we leave, that's also acceptable. And I'll see you next week then.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice weekend.
Thank you. Appreciate it.